Hey, hi everyone. You're welcome back again to our Biorisk Management series. And my name remains Dr. Iya Ezebasi. Today we are going to be doing a very interesting topic called the Biorisk Characterization and Evaluation. If you remember the AMP model from the last lecture, the Assessment Mitigation Performance Model, you have the assessment part, which is what we're doing today, and consists of Biorisk characterization and evaluation. All right. So like I said, this course is based on the Global Biorisk Management Curriculum Library that is funded by the US DOT DTR Cooperative Biological Engagement Program and is managed by the Sandia Laboratories as well as the International Biological Chemical Threat Reduction Program. And I use this curriculum because it's one of the most widely, accepted or globally accepted curriculum. And I think we're going to enjoy ourselves. Meanwhile, I want to say thank you so much for your support. Please help to like our videos, share, subscribe, to other people who may benefit from it. Please learn to also leave a comment. Tell us if you like what we are doing or you think we could add something to make it more interesting. Please let us know. I value your feedback so much. So, like I said, if you do remember the Biorisk management model, the AMP model, it consists of what? The assessment, the mitigation, and performance arms of that model. So this session, I would expect that you should have a more complete understanding of the risk characterization and evaluation of the processes that we find within the Biorisk assessment. So what is Biorisk assessment actually, or biological risk assessment, as some other people may call it? A biological risk assessment is an analytical procedure designed to characterize biological risk in a facility, a laboratory, or a unit within it, or other type of operation dealing with potential pathogens or toxins. Like I did say in the last lecture, that when you work, in a laboratory, especially, which is my specialization, you will find out that you work with a lot of risk, ranging from physical to biological, and that biological materials have one of the highest levels of risk, which is why we are actually interested in it. And you need to be able to characterize your risk, and you can't characterize it just by looking at it. There is a set way, there is a set procedure, that you use to characterize, those biological risks. And the risk we had discussed before, you have your biosafety risk assessment, you have your biosecurity risk assessment, okay? Just like you have your biosafety risk and you have your biosecurity risk, all right? So your assessment covers both biosafety risk, you have a different part for it, and your biosecurity risk assessment. So your biosafety risk assessment is an analytical procedure that is designed to characterize safety risk in a laboratory. Remember that very interesting diagram in our series 1, where we were trying to save, the scientists, the mad scientists, sorry, from exposure, to the biological toxins, he was working with. So for you to be able to do that, you need to have a biosafety risk assessment. On the other hand, a biosecurity risk assessment is an analytical procedure that is designed to characterize security risk in a laboratory. I kind of explained in the last video that you are not only trying to save the scientists, from emissions from biological materials, injury, and all that. But you're also trying to protect the material, the pathogen, the toxins from people who have bad intent, who want to cause intentionally, they have it in mind and they want to cause an intentional release of those pathogens or toxins so that they can cause, problems in the world. So that is also why you need a biosecurity risk assessment. All right. So Why are we so concerned about biological risk assessment? Why do we need it? We need a biological risk assessment because it allows a facility, a laboratory, a unit, whatever, to determine the relative level of risk its different activities pose and helps to guide your risk mitigation decisions so that they are targeted to the most important risk. A lot of procedures that go on in the lab, release different types of toxins. Some of them may be harmless, some of them may be very dangerous, if they get out. And so depending on their level of risk, if you're able to assess, the level of this risk, you can decide which mitigation decisions to use. For instance, if your laboratory procedure is releasing aerosols, okay, it will determine the type of PPE, that's your personal protective equipment that you are going to use. Are you going to use a respirator? Are you going to use goggles? Are you going to use whatever it is you're going to use? But if it doesn't produce aerosols, maybe it has to do with if it touches your skin, your skin is exposed to it. So you know that you have to cover up everywhere, gloves, up to this, your feet, your face, everything has to be covered up. So you see some people looking like space kind of people, during the COVID era and things like that. So it determines the kind of mitigation decisions you're going to use. So now, what is risk? I asked this question in the last class, and I think I gave it an assignment. Risk is a function of both the likelihood of something happening and the consequences of that occurrence. So it's like a function of likelihood and consequence, all right? And it's represented on a graph that is modeled like this one that you're seeing here. So now let's enter into fun time, and I'm going to ask you a question. Okay, so if I ask you, you are the biorisk management person, and I ask you, what is the risk of being attacked by a tiger? You won't just go ahead and tell me that the risk is very high. Tiger can attack. No, you need to look at the whole picture. You need to look at the situation. You need to ask yourself some very good questions before you can say, because there are some situations you meet a tiger, it's not risky, while there are some situations it's actually risky, So you have to look at the whole picture. You have to ask questions like, all right, is the tiger caged? Is it free? Is it in the wild? How close is it to me? Am I looking at it like 100 meters away, or am I face to face with it? Do I have an opportunity to run if I can run? Another question you need to ask yourself, is that tiger hungry? Has it just been fed? Is it looking for its next meal? You want to ask, is it angry? Is it provoked? Or is it calm, just looking at me? Is it a baby tiger? Or is it a full-grown one? You know that the damage that will be caused by a full-grown tiger will be far, far worse than that caused by a baby tiger. You want to know what kind of protective equipment you have. Do you have a gun? Do you have a zoo wall? Do you have a cage? What do you have to protect yourself? You want to ask, do you have the skills to handle the tiger? For instance, if you're a trained zookeeper, you should be able to handle that. And you want to ask, what is the sex of the tiger? It's very, very important. You may not understand. Recently, I went to kill my roosters, one of my roosters' females. And since then, I have been on constant attack. It's either pecking my legs, pecking trying to remove my eyes and things like that. So if it's a male tiger and this is mating season, you don't want to be anywhere near him or his females, because, that can spell doom for you. If it's a female, you don't want to meet a female who has just had babies, because a mother can give her life for her children. You can do anything to her, she doesn't have any problem, but touch her kids and you know that something is going to happen to you. So you want to know the sex of the tiger. All these situations will help you to determine the risk of being attacked by a tiger. Do you understand? All right, so for instance, if you are in an open field and you're next to a very hungry, aggressive adult tiger, and the tiger is unrestrained and sees you as food, what level of risk do you think you will be at? Really, the likelihood of it attacking you is very high because it's free, it's annoyed, it's big enough, and you are food, it's hungry. All right. And if it even gets you, the consequence of what will happen to you is very bad because it will surely tear you to pieces. So the risk, therefore, in that particular situation will be very high. You can see my star right here. We have put it. Let's look at the second scenario. You are in a zoo, you're observing a caged adult tiger, which is well fed and has a mild temperament. All right. So what is the likelihood of it escaping? It's going to be very low because of all the security around it. But then if it happens to escape here, what are the consequences? They will still be as bad as the first scenario. But you find out that the risk is not as high because the likelihood is low, though the consequence is high. So the risk will be like low, all right? And then if you are holding a tiger cub with a playful temperament in your arms, I just wonder why you want to put your finger inside that tiger's mouth. I'm still wondering. Anyway, you put yourself in that kind of situation. The likelihood that something bad is going to happen is high. Yes, look at that finger, it's in his mouth. I'm worried. The likelihood is very high. But the consequences, because it is a baby tiger, the force it will use to bite, and all that is not that much. So the consequences will be low. Therefore, you see where I put my star. If you look at the risk also, it is low. Okay? Let's look at the fourth scenario. If you are at the zoo, you're observing a male tiger, baby tiger, tiger cub located behind a strong glass. What is the risk? The risk, the likelihood of anything bad happening is low. The consequences is also low. So your risk will be very low. So you can see how the different situations have modified or have determined how we calculate our risk for certain situations. So you can see that it is not all situations where you meet a tiger that it is dangerous. So risk assessment. So what is then risk assessment? A risk assessment can be said to be a process or a procedure that characterizes a particular situation in order to determine the likelihood and consequences of a certain adverse event, which is called your risk characterization, and supports decision-making regarding the acceptability of that risk, which is your risk, evaluation. You want to characterize the risk. Is it high risk? Is it low risk? Is it a medium risk? And you want to ask yourself, okay, I have characterized it and I've seen this level of risk. Is that risk acceptable to me or not? That all is embedded in risk assessment. So what risk assessment will do will be to assign values for likelihood and consequences, and that assignment allows us to represent the risk of a particular adverse event on a graph as shown here. You can remember the former examples we did on the tiger. So this is a diagram that describes your risk assessment strategies, starting from describing your work activities to identifying the hazards. You should also be able to determine the risk. If you do that, you have done what is called your characterization. Then you decide whether or not it is acceptable. If it is acceptable, you proceed with your work and you monitor. If it is not acceptable, you can choose to do two things, actually. You can choose to close down the project, which means you will lose a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of resources that have been put into that work. But you could also say, no, I don't want to lose all this money. I don't want to lose all this work. What I'm going to do is to prepare a risk control action plan, and implement those actions, and then review and see if those actions I took are adequate. If they are not, I can review it to make it better. All right. And when I do that, I have to now decide whether the risk is still acceptable or it is not acceptable. All right. So this is the Biorisk assessment mitigation performance model. So what's the objective of risk assessment? You do a risk assessment because you want to support the selection of appropriate laboratory biosafety and laboratory biorisk mitigation measures, because you want to reduce the likelihood and consequences of either injury, falling ill, sickness, or even having somebody breaking into the lab to take those highly pathogenic laboratory materials and cause problems with them. So let's look at certain things. We'll look at the question, what factors should be considered in a laboratory biosafety or biorisk assessment? What are the factors that affect your likelihood and or consequences? And then when you do that, characterize these factors that you have identified in step 1, as being important for a laboratory biosafety or a biosecurity risk. I hope you understand what we are asking you to do, that you should look at the factors that can affect your likelihood or consequences, when doing a laboratory biosafety or biorisk assessment. All right. So what do you think we need, or what do you think are important? And then group them under biosafety or under biorisk. All right. So let me see what we have. For the biosafety factors, things that could affect our biorisk assessment include your method of waste disposal, your duration of exposure to the pathogenic material, what is the virulence of that material, what is your laboratory design like, and what is the route of exposure of that pathogen or of that toxin. For some, it may be aerosols. For some, it may be contact, percutaneous contact, that's through exposure to the skin. All right. For biosecurity factors, you want to think about the motive of the person with the bad intent. What does he have in mind to do? That can also determine, the level of risk. Then, what is the location of your lab? Where is it located? Is it very difficult to access, or is it something that I can just take a KK, drop, and walk into it without anybody asking me a question? What kind of security is available to secure the agents? Where did you keep them? Did you just keep them in an unlocked cupboard, or did you keep them in a safe, which is locked up in another safe, which is locked up in a room that has controls that needs biometrics, that needs handprinting, and all that? What is the security of the agent? How accessible is it? And then what are the access controls? What do you need, to go through? What kind of screening do you need to go through to be able to access, those agents? Like if you go to the lab, you see some rooms, they say unauthorized personnel not allowed. There are some labs that you need to carry a card that you need to swipe on the door to allow you in, and all that. There are some other places you need to fingerprint before they allow you in and all that. So what are the kind of access controls? And then what are the opportunities? Are there any gaps, in security that a person with a bad motive can take advantage of? Like if it's time for lunch, does everybody leave? Is there a protocol behind shutting up and all that? Those are the opportunities that the person can take. And then you find out that there are some factors which are relevant to both biosecurity factors as well as biosafety factors, like what kind of training do your staff have, what kind of competency do they have, how competent are they, highly trained or highly skilled staff, or they are low-level skilled staff. What kind of infrastructure and equipment do you have? Are you running a tertiary lab, a primary lab, a secondary lab, and all that? What are the adherence, to safety measures by the staff, that work there? Those things are factors that can determine the likelihood and or the consequences attached to certain materials. So we have identified all the factors that should be considered in laboratory biosafety biorisk assessment, okay? So your risk characterization, which is the step 1 in a risk assessment, is the actual process of determining the likelihood and consequences of a particular risk within a risk assessment. You have to recall that, every risk that you see is associated with a particular adverse event, and we can only determine the likelihood and consequences of a very well-defined risk. Your risk must be defined, okay? So the first step in your risk assessment is to be able to identify your hazards or your threats based on the situation. For instance, your hazard is something that is, this time around, is the biological material that has the potential to cause harm, or the toxin that has the potential to cause harm, while the threat is someone, is a person with an intent, to cause harm. Do you understand? So the term hazard now will be used in the biosafety context, while the term threat will be used in the biosecurity context. Okay, so after that, the next step is for you to be able to characterize your hazards, and your treats based upon the likelihood and consequences. Like for a hazard, which is the biological material or the toxin that you're talking about, you have to consider the likelihood of the hazard to cause harm and the extent of harm, that it can cause. There are some hazards that can kill you in less than 15 seconds. There are some toxins that can deal with you in less than 15 seconds. Those are very high risk. There are some that you need to be exposed to them over time, like chronic exposure. There are some, that are spread through aerosols. You can just take them in, it goes into your system immediately and all that. So for a hazard, you have to consider the likelihood of the hazard to cause harm and the extent of harm it can cause. For a threat, actually, you have to consider the likelihood of that threat to successfully achieve their goal and the consequences of that goal. For instance, you have to be able to consider how easy will it be for this person with a bad intent, for this thief, to be able to enter into your lab and remove those agents and carry them out? And if they carry them out and they release them, if they carry them out and release them into the environment or into the community, what are the consequences of that action that they have done? Those are the things we need to think of. These are very serious things, which is why we need to be very, very careful in our characterization. All right. So for biosafety risk, the hazard is the biological material that you work with in the lab. So when you characterize the material, it allows you to determine important parameters for likelihood and consequences. Like it allows you to determine what is your route of exposure, what dose is infectious, what's the incubation time, what kind of morbidity is associated with that particular material, but the mortality rate, how fatal is it? Then communicability, is it a communicable disease, and other things. That is what characterization helps you to do. For the biosecurity, on the other hand, the threat is an adversary that is aiming to acquire the biological material and use it to cause harm. The person must have a bad intent, And characterizing potential adversaries allows you to determine important parameters for likelihood and consequence, such as what's the means, is it, what kind of machinery are they bringing? There are some people that come and they use chemicals, pour on the wall, and the wall cuts into two, and they are inside your house. What are the kind of means that they have? What are the motives? What are their driving force? And what opportunities have you allowed them to have to enter into your lab? Then let's look at a scenario. This should be a biosafety scenario, okay? So a lab worker has just prepared a culture of Mycobacterium tuberculosis in order to conduct a drug sensitivity test. He is wearing gloves, he's wearing a surgical mask and a lab coat, and he is using a biosafety cabinet which has not been certified in 3 years. What? Ha! That is serious. I admire. This is very, very serious, okay? So what is the hazard in this situation? So tell me now, what is the hazard in this situation? Very simple questions. And what factors, using the factors that you have considered previously, all we've talked about, what is the likelihood of exposure? And what are the consequences of exposure? And then let's hear what are some of the factors you will consider. So what do you think is the hazard? I'm waiting for an answer. Start typing it in your comment section. All right, so the hazard will be your Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the culture of your Mycobacterium tuberculosis. That is the hazard. That's the biological material you're dealing with. And what is the likelihood of exposure? For me, the likelihood of exposure is very high. And what are the consequences of exposure? Do you know what TB can do to you? Mycobacterium tuberculosis causes TB, whether it is spinal TB, any kind of TB that you are thinking of, it's bad. You don't want to have TB. So the consequences of exposure are very, very high. So what are the factors did I look at to make this decision? Did I just wake up and say, no, tuberculosis is high? No. Number one, that biosafety cabinet that he's using has not been certified for 3 years. You don't even know whether that biosafety cabinet is working. In fact, it may work in such a way that it is working to infect you. Your biosafety cabinet has to be regularly certified, and then the kind of personal protective equipment is using is not the correct type. You're dealing, for goodness sake, when you come to things like Mycobacterium tuberculosis, every culture is guilty until proven innocent. So you need to protect yourself. You need to protect your life. You need to protect the people that you live with. Okay, so you shouldn't be wearing just surgical gloves, no surgical mask. You should be using something like a respirator. And then there's also a lack of training and non-compliance to SOP, because if the person were well trained, he will not be using this kind of personal protective equipment that he has. He would have checked that cabinet to see whether that cabinet has been certified recently. All right? Okay. So let's look at the second scenario. All right, this should be a biosecurity scenario. So the lab worker discovers that his culture of Mycobacterium tuberculosis is extremely drug resistant. I'm not talking. He just discovered. Meanwhile, he did not use the correct PPE. Father in heaven, have mercy. The lab worker discovers that his culture of Mycobacterium tuberculosis is extremely drug resistant. Meanwhile, a local animal rights group has threatened to disrupt laboratory operations and generate publicity by breaking in and stealing agents. They believe taking samples of XDR will generate the most publicity. I also admire the tenacity of these people. because I don't think they know what they're dealing with. If they actually knew what they're dealing with, they won't do this. Don't think that this is a story. This has happened in real life. There was a situation in our country where people actually broke into specialist hospitals and removed freezers containing these kind of pathogens inside the fridge. And they stole the freezer away, poured out the things, and they carried the freezer home. Imagine the kind of outbreak that is going to occur in the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. So what is the threat in this situation? Very easy to answer. And using the factors that we've been discussing, what is the likelihood of exposure and what are the consequences of exposure? What are some factors that you consider, before answering this question? So start typing inside the comment box. Start typing now. All right. So the threat will be the local animal rights group. And well, the likelihood of exposure depends, on the surrounding situations, which may make it high or moderate. Why do I say it depends on the surrounding situations? For instance, what kind of security does the lab have? Is it somewhere you can just walk into and get those things out? Or is it somewhere where the access to those things are highly guarded? You cannot get into it without passing through some controls. Okay? So if it is highly guarded, then, well, the likelihood may be low because they may not be able to get into there. But if it is not, well, the situation, the likelihood will be high. So what are the consequences of exposure? No matter how you see it, if they get their hands on it, the consequences will be very, very high. Because number one, starting from themselves, they will start being infected by themselves. Then they will now release it into the community, and you will now have a cascade reaction where the whole place, you now have what do they call this? Is a plague. All right, so what are some of the factors that we should consider? Number one, the culture of the XDR mycobacterium. It is extremely drug resistant. That means that you can hardly get the drugs that will cure it. It's something that should not go out. Then what is the motive, of the people that want to get in there? What is their motive? How motivated are they? If they are highly motivated, they will look up any way to get into that place. Then what are the opportunities? What are the means? Then also, I am very sure that these people don't know that what they are dealing with is the highly dangerous, extremely drug-resistant Mycobacterium tuberculosis. If they knew, I don't think that they would even stand 10 miles near that place, because you don't want to be infected with something that cannot be treated. So things you should note is that a hazard or a threat cannot in itself pose a risk without a specific situation. And a situation does not represent a risk if there is no hazard or threat. So they are interdependent. You should also note that both a changing hazard or threat and a changing situations will independently alter the scenario being assessed and thus change the risk. Why do we say so? Okay, let's look at that scenario again. Let's look at the biosafety scenario. Okay, let's look at what will happen to the risk in the situations of the biosafety and biosecurity scenarios that we have looked at was altered. For instance, for the biosafety scenario, how will the risk change if the lab worker wore a respirator instead of a surgical mask, and he was working in the biosafety cabinet that have been certified in the last 6 months? Surely the risk will reduce, because even though the consequence remains the same, the likelihood, of that exposure has been highly reduced by the use of the right PPE and the right equipment. Okay? Then let's look at the biosecurity. If there were strict physical security measures at the place or the laboratory to keep out unauthorized people, how would that, affect it? I think I had already discussed it when I was trying to tell you why I think that the the likelihood, could change. For instance, if you have good access controls, good engineering controls and all that, it can keep them away. So even if the consequence remains the same, the likelihood, will change. So it is good to note that whereas the hazard or threat can affect both likelihood and consequences of a risk, the situation will likely only affect the likelihood. If you look at both sides, the situation changed actually affected just the likelihood. The consequence remains the same because the agent remained the same. So, for example, if a biological agent is highly infectious through the aerosol route, that is through breathing it in, that is the hazard characteristic, and the procedure being implemented is a procedure where large volume aerosols are being generated close to the worker. So PPE such as respirators and biosafety cabinets, if not available, we can say that the likelihood of exposure is high. But if they are available, we can say the likelihood of exposure is low. But you will find out that the consequence of that thing being released or being unintentionally exposed remains the same. If that same biological agent does not produce a serious disease, that now we are talking about the hazard itself, and furthermore, an effective vaccine has been administered to all personnel, we can say that the consequence of the exposure is low. That is because the hazard has been changed from a dangerous one to a much, much milder type of hazard. So, another consideration when you are characterizing risk is the concept of relative risk. Okay, what is relative risk? The relative risk is the value of one particular risk in terms of likelihood and consequences in the context of another risk. For instance, if you are looking at the situation where the PPE was used, you may find out that the risk of aerosol exposure may be higher than that of percutaneous exposure. So you have to, your PPE has to be steered towards aerosol, reducing the risk of aerosol exposure. So the risk now is relative due to the factors that go, due to the fact that the factors that go into determining the risk are not absolute. Things can change. You understand? So it's relative risk, if you like. If you are looking at the risk in terms of aerosol exposure, it may be higher than in terms of percutaneous, exposure. So if you understand the relative risk that is associated with different situations, or you implement different risk mitigation strategies, it is important for the overall process of characterizing the risk, because if you do not understand that this is the way of exposure of this material, and you are using PPE gear to another route of exposure, you have not characterized that risk well, and therefore your mitigation will not be appropriate. So each facility, each lab, each situation will have its own unique set of factors that will be particularly relevant to fully characterize that particular risk. So, for instance, if you are looking at biosafety, you can find out that things like the use of PPE can lower your likelihood of exposure, all right? Vaccines also, if you use a vaccine, it can lower the consequence of exposure, all right? So those are things you need to think of when you are characterizing risk. For instance, if you are thinking of the biosecurity situation, if you use physical barriers like a gate, like a safe, and all that, you can find out that you lower the likelihood of theft. If also you have drugs or therapeutics that can lower the consequences of the theft and malicious diseases, you can actually lower the consequences. As if there are drugs that can treat that agent, you can actually lower the consequences of theft or malicious release. So risk characterization. When you are characterizing risk, it is important that the process you are using should be as robust, as possible. You should be able to do a risk characterization. Another person also uses the same situation, the same method to do a risk characterization, and both of the results you will get will compare with each other. You should also be able to conduct that same, process in the same way for the same hazard over a period of time and still, get the same kind of results. That is repeatability. That is when you will know that your risk characterization process is robust. So what then is comparability? It is the ability to trust the accuracy of differences between assessments due to similarities in your basis, your assumption, your procedures, and your protocols. So if we all use the same type of protocols, the same type of basis, the same type of assumptions, we can trust that the differences that we have between assessments are correct. Okay? Then repeatability is the ability to conduct that same process in the same way for the same hazard or threat and situation over a period of time, or for different hazards and threats and situations at the same time and get the same result. Not when you do it the first time, you get this result, you do it the second time. For the same thing, when you're getting another result, you do it the third time, you're getting another result. You should be able to, over time, conduct, if it's for that same hazard or threat or situation, over a period of time, you should be able to get the same results you are getting, So, a robust risk characterization process will generate similar results when assessing similar hazards or threats in similar situations, no matter who is following that methodology. So, no matter who is following that methodology, no matter where the characterization is being conducted, or no matter where it's occurring, if you do have a robust risk characterization process, you will generate similar results when you have similar hazards and similar threats and similar situations. I have said that before. So note that a robust risk characterization will make a risk assessment robust. So because I think of the subjectiveness of human, thinking and all that, the way you see a rat, I may look at the same rat and call it a rabbit. Okay, I may see a rat, I may look at the same rat and call it a mouse. So you need tools that can aid, and one of those tools that have now become available to use in laboratory risk assessment is the Biosafety and Biosecurity RAM, in short called BioRAM. This BioRAM is a computerized risk assessment tool that has been developed by the Sandia National Laboratories in partnership with the international community, and it helps to facilitate biosafety and biosecurity risk assessment by simplifying risk characterization. So, what happens is that the BioRAM uses just one of the several risk assessment methodologies. There are several, but it uses one, and it is based on the input of biosafety experts all over the world, and it has also been validated. And it helps you to determine the relative risk levels in a comparable and repeatable way. This website, you can actually go there and download a sample of the app and play with it if you want to. All right, so risk evaluation. We have finished with risk characterization, which is the first step in risk assessment, and we are down to the second step, which is risk evaluation. So what is a risk evaluation? It is a crucial intermediary step between risk characterization and taking an active step towards mitigating risk. Remember, when we're looking at that diagram, we had to ask ourselves that this risk that we have seen, is it acceptable or is it not acceptable? So that process of determining that acceptability is called risk evaluation, and it's the process of determining subjectively whether a risk is high or low, or whether it is acceptable. If it's acceptable, you proceed with the work, or if it is not acceptable, you either stop the work or you begin to implement risk mitigation measures if you want to go forward with the work. So risk evaluation helps you to answer questions like, if this risk is determined to be high, is it unacceptable? If it's unacceptable, what do we do? Do we stop the work? What is the impact of stopping the work? You know, or do we implement risk mitigation measures to lower the risk? And what are the impacts to implementation of the risk mitigation measures? Do we have enough funding to be able to carry out that? Is it really necessary to carry out that? You know, how good will it reduce the risk associated with the thing that we are doing? So, risk evaluation. Let us ask ourselves, what is acceptable risk? For me, if you look at what this guy is doing, for him, he's happy doing it, but for me, it is not acceptable. Number one, I don't even have the gift of climbing. Number two, I have vertigo, which means I'm going to fall down. This risk is not acceptable. But it's subjective. To him, it may be. To me, it is certainly not. I said, why would I be even doing that? What if I fall and die? What next? So risk evaluation. So the evaluation of risk is, highly related to the concept of risk acceptance. You have to evaluate the risk to be able to know whether you're accepting the risk or not. Okay, so risk evaluation and risk acceptance can vary with the culture, the experience, the resources, the management, and even current events. All right, so there is actually no systematic way of evaluating risk or determining risk acceptability. This will depend on the individuals. It will depend on the institutions, that are carrying out the work. It will also depend on the community where that work is situated. Does the community think that the risk that you're bringing there is acceptable to them? So I want to ask you a fun question. What factors might drive differences in risk acceptabilities in individuals, in institutions, in communities? I want you to take some time. You can pause the video, sit down and think, what factors might drive differences in risk acceptability between individuals, institutions, and communities. So begin to type it down in the comment section. Let's see. So if you're talking about individual factors, you can think of personal preferences. I may think, one person may think that, if 20 people die, the risk is acceptable. Another person may say, no, even one person should not die. It's personal preferences. Some people don't mind 100 people, 1,000 people dying to be able to get out what they think is important, while others don't. Your belief systems, your religion, what do you believe? What do you stand for? Your reputation as a researcher, as a teacher, as, that thing. And then what kind of funding do you have? Can your funding carry out, mitigation practices that will help curb the spread of whatever you're working on, reduce the risk of whatever you're working with? Those are individual factors, that may affect. For institutional factors, the reputation of that institution, especially if there are institutions that are maybe trying to gain reputations, or institutions that have built reputation over time, want to sully their name. What are the legal issues attached? If somebody dies and they sue us to court, how much are we going to pay? Do we have that kind of funding to be able to, carry out risk mitigation procedures for this particular work? Do we have the infrastructure? Is this something that can be done in a one room that has no ventilation, something that needs high-class equipment? What kind of management are you working with? What kind of commitment do the management have to the work that you're doing? What are the policies on ground? Because policies rule the things that we do. What are the rules? What are the regulations on ground? Okay, so for community factors, what's the community awareness? I remember once we went to collect blood samples. One of my students went to collect blood samples from children. She was doing her PhD work, and it was a time where there was this rumor going about that people were being injected with HIV and all that. And as they went into that community to collect blood, they were almost beaten, to their last, because the community thought these people have come again. That was their level of awareness. It took, the community head, the investigators talking to the community head, assuring them, carrying out, flyers and things, explaining to the people what they were doing before they were able to get any samples. So what's the community awareness? What are the norms and values and belief systems they affect? What's the religion, the prevailing thing? What do the people stand for? What is their culture? Will the thing that you're doing offend their gods? What is the educational level, the educational standard, advancement? What are the benefits they are going to get? Because in this life, anything you do, the question the other person will ask is that, what is it in there for me? So what are the benefits to the community? What is the political and community interest? What kind of negative impact will it have on the community? Those are the community factors. And if you don't put this into place, your work may not go smoothly. So if an institution finds a particular risk unacceptable, what it will do is that it will either stop the work, that is causing that unacceptable risk, or it will find ways to mitigate that risk to a more acceptable level. But even then, they have to make sure that the community accepts that particular risk, because the community risk acceptability is important for the institution. Because if that institution stands in conflict with the community, it may not be able to operate. And I tell you, especially when the motive is high, the community might end up burning up that institution so that they can leave. So it is only when an institution can determine whether a particular risk is very high, moderate, or low, that that it may be able to determine whether that risk is acceptable or not. So the question I want to ask you is that, how can you communicate your risk evaluation, maybe to the community, to your funders and all that? How will you depict it on the likelihood consequences graph of risk? So you should be able to do that. So when you talk about risk evaluation, the curves on this graph is called risk tolerance curve, and it shows different levels of risk. We've seen this from very low to moderate to high to very high. And it is important for you to recognize the precise location of this risk tolerance curve on the graph, that you should recognize that they are arbitrary. They can change. They can actually change. It's not static, as it were. And this is the essence of risk evaluation. Depending on if an institution is risk averse or risk tolerance, these particular curves can change. Okay. For instance, different institutions will have different definitions of what is high and low. I think I told you that some people may think that if 1,000 people die, there's no problem, it's for the good of humanity. While some other persons may say not one person must die. So different institutions will have different definition for what is high risk or low risk, okay? Or even what the shapes of the curve are, all right? So we can see two different institutions. One saying, no, stop that work, that risk is unacceptable. Another one is saying, go ahead, the risk is acceptable. But that is still the same situation, and two different institutions taking different parts or stand on it. So I want to ask you before we go forward, what is the difference between a risk-averse and a risk-tolerant institution, okay? What is the difference between when you say something or someone is risk-averse and someone is risk-tolerant? And how might these two characteristics be depicted using risk tolerance scores on the likelihood consequences graphs, all right? So look at this. This is our default, risk graph, okay? So I want you to show me what a risk averse one would look like and what a risk tolerant one would look like. I'll give you some minutes. You can pause this video while you do that for me. All right. So if you have an institution that is risk averse, they do not like risk, you will find out that their curve, looks like this. They give more chance to anything that their tolerance level is low. They don't want any risk. So you find out that the space for very high risk becomes, bigger compared to other ones. But for the risk tolerant people, you will find out that anything goes. So their graph looks like this, with a very large portion, depicting very low. But if you check this same very place, another institution may not accept this risk as very low. You will likely have it to be high, or very high. You can see the risk averse graph. This is the start, the same point for the risk averse and for the risk tolerant. And you find out that for the risk averse, that risk is not acceptable, while for the risk tolerant, that risk is acceptable. All right? So the risk evaluation is what drives investment decisions in an institution. For instance, if an institution is particularly risk averse, you will find that it will spend more resources attempting to reduce the risk it faces. It doesn't want problem. So it spends a lot of money trying to reduce risk, while another institution who faces the same risk but is risk tolerant will just proceed to do the procedures like that, waiting concern me with overload. I want to do this because maybe it's going to bring me money or it's going to bring fame and all that, and you don't care the kind of risk that you are exposing others to. All right? So let's look at this. So if an institution is focused only on the potential, that's the likelihood of something bad happening, but less concerned about the level of consequences, they are considered to be likelihood adverse. But if an institution is only worried about consequences, regardless of the potential for occurrence, they are called consequence adverse. You know what is the likelihood of something occurring, and you know what is the consequence when it happens. What are the consequences, okay? So some institutions are likelihood adverse, while some are consequence, adverse. So this is what the curve would look like. This is the default curve. We can see here where the star is. This is moderate. For a likelihood adverse institution, this is what their curves will look like, okay? While for the consequence adverse institution, this is what their curves would look like. So, having said that, we'll remember that describing work activities, identifying hazards, identify any threats, determine the risk is what makes up risk assessment, which is risk assessment, yes, a risk assessment, which is a part of the AMP model. Let me take that again, sorry. If you describe the work activities, identify hazards, identify the traits, and determine the risk, okay? That is actually the risk characterization part of the risk assessment. Then, when you start deciding whether the risk is acceptable or not, and decide whether you want to proceed with the work or stop the work, okay? determining whether it's acceptable or not, whether you want to continue with the work, or if you don't want to continue the work, you want to stop the work. That is your risk evaluation. And your risk evaluation and your risk evaluation and your risk characterization makes of assessment. Okay, so before we go, these are some of the risk practice questions I brought up for you. Please, I want you to go through them, answer them. Please, you will submit these answers in my next class. That is your assignment that is going to be graded. All right? So, we have learned about risk characterization and risk evaluation. I want you to summarize this whole lecture and put it in your video comment section, okay? Let me know, what did you learn? What do these things mean? And how can we utilize these things, okay? These are my references. Thank you very much for listening. Don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to share our videos, don't forget to put your summary down. Thank you so much. Bye. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.